Hello and welcome to the RICS World Built Environment Forum webinar series. Today's webinar is in partnership with Asite, who is also the forum's lead technical partner. My name is Ken Creighton. I'm the Director of Thought Leadership and Public Affairs at RICS. And today we will be discussing Race to Zero, Decarbonizing the Built Environment. I'd like to now introduce our panel. First, we have Phil McNally. He is senior researcher on net zero, the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Hello, Phil.
Good morning, Ken.
Good morning. Next, we have Nathan Dowdy, the CEO of Asite, our host and sponsor today. Hello, Nathan.
Good morning, Ken. Thank you. Nice
Good
to
morning. Welcome. Next, we have Nidhi Beswar, Sustainability and Climate Leadership Director at JLL. Hello, Nidhi.
Hi, Ken. Hi, everyone.
And we have Huda Shaka, City Advisor and Sustainable Development Expert. Welcome, Huda.
Hello, everyone. Thank you.
We have over 370 people registered to attend this webinar from over 50 different countries. Welcome to you all. We welcome your active involvement. So please feel free to submit questions to the panel through the technology in front of you. It really helps bring the conversation to life, and I will do my best to come to as many of your questions as I can. Speaking of questions, let's get right into it. The first question, maybe go to Phil and then Huda, and from the perspective of both the UK and Saudi Arabia or the Middle East. Phil, where is the UK currently placed in the race to zero? How does it compare with other countries?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I think it's fair to say that in sort of recent times, the UK has been setting the pace in terms of the race to zero. So just to give some of the high level targets that we have at the moment, we have the net zero target by 2050, of course, and then two maybe less publicized but equally important targets to reduce emissions by 2030 and 2035. So they are to reduce emissions by 68% from 1990 levels by 2030, and then 78% by 2035. So these targets are really important for setting us on a trajectory towards net zero by 2050. And they're some of the most ambitious targets that you'll see around the world. So in terms of the UK's role as a leader, I think the fact that we were the first major economy to set the net zero target back in 2019, and only sort of 3 years later now, over 70% of the world's GDP is also covered by similar net zero targets. So that's a really positive development in that respect. So in terms of the UK's role compared to other sort of wealthy nations, if you look at the G7, the UK has performed a lot better than G7 counterparts in recent years. So we've reduced our emissions by roughly 45% since 1990, whilst growing our economy at a slightly higher rate than other G7 nations. If you take the G7 average for emissions reductions over that period, then it's only 2% emissions reduction compared to 45% in the UK. So if you look at it from that angle, it's a very positive story on the UK's behalf. But then now, as we start to look forward, I'd say a lot of the decarbonisation that's happened to date has been some of the low-hanging fruit, some of the easier things, and a lot of it has come from the power sector. So increased amount of renewable power generation and a shift away from coal-fired power. They've been really key in reducing emissions. But none of these things tend to interact with the day-to-day lives of people. So turn the light switch on, the light comes on. It doesn't matter if it comes from coal power or from renewable power for the everyday person. So it's that next stage of decarbonisation that's really, really challenging. And I think that's where now we're seeing momentum start to stall a little bit in the UK as we move to try and decarbonise buildings and transport, because these are they have a lot more interaction with the day-to-day lives of people. So the politics is a lot more difficult, and incentivizing people to make behavior change and spend money on these changes is really challenging. So I think in terms of the UK's role as a leader moving forward, the next sort of 5 years will really define that, whether we can continue that momentum. But in the recent past, I'd say there's a fair claim to sort of leading the way the race to zero in recent times.
Thanks, Phil. Huda, can we come to you for the same question? Where do you see the Middle East in this journey?
Thank you, Ken. If we focus on, let's say, the countries of the Arabian Gulf, I think it's probably fair to say that they are fairly young countries and in a lot of ways catching up. There was a very exciting announcement end of last week. So on October 7th, the UAE announced that the first net zero target for the region. So they announced a net zero target by 2050. It's not 100% clear whether it's a net zero greenhouse gas or a net zero carbon dioxide. Nevertheless, it is a net zero, the first net zero target in the region. So that sets the precedence. I think shows leadership, and I'm sure others will follow. So that is a positive turn. Looking across the region, most countries and many of the major cities have targets for moving away from natural gas to renewable or clean energy. There's already a nuclear power plant operational in the UAE. Over the past 5 to 10 years, there have been regulations introduced for new buildings to cut down energy and water consumption. But we're still probably at the low-hanging fruit. So the topic of existing buildings hasn't really been, it's still early steps. People are talking about it, people are thinking of retrofit, but there's no legislation requiring existing buildings to become more efficient. There's also discussion around moving industry away from oil and gas production towards potentially clean hydrogen or other less carbon intensive industries. I think the fact is there needs to be a diversification of the economy. All the countries know that. It's about how do we get there.
Thank you for that. Needy, if we can come to you, how are investors, purchasers, and occupiers being influenced by Net Zero 2050? And you're on mute, I believe, Needy.
Apologies for that. Now, I was going to say that this is a good question. I think this decade is being seen as the tipping point in decarbonizing the built environment. So both investors and occupiers are making bold commitments, and they're making it at a very fast pace and setting targets to reach net zero by 2030 or even sooner than that. I think pandemic has also acted as a wake-up call for environmental and social responsibility. So which will require the built environment to make complex changes, I think, and there will be a critical shift for the industry. JLL internally, we carried out a research where we surveyed about 426 corporate occupiers and about 200 real estate investors and asked them about their journey to net zero. And the results of the survey was very interesting. We've got about in terms of our global investor clients, 43% of them have already started setting their targets and goals. It's become very clear from our survey that climate risk is a financial risk, and it's currently being identified by our investors. So that's, I think, a very positive note on the investors' side. There are other things as well that are currently in the market in terms of green financing, green loans, funds and bonds, and I think that's really that is moving them or getting a good momentum at this stage, where our investors are really setting those sustainability objectives, which affect the interest rates, of course, when they're borrowing money. So overall, it is going in the right direction, and it needs this shift needs to happen sooner rather than later. So investors are now also becoming aware of the term stranded asset, which was not known to them a couple of years back. And what this means is that they are putting their money very carefully and trying to understand an asset as it currently stands if they are making an investment. So how can they take that asset to the net zero carbon journey? And they're trying to ask questions at a very early stage to check if their investment is going to get the returns that they want to see in 20, 30 years of time. So I can give you one recent example that I came across within JLL. A commercial building in Europe was meant to be sold, and a traditional valuation was carried out before it was taken into the market. Now, when the asset went into the market, it was sold for about 30% lower than the valuation that was carried out. The reason for this is that the valuers were relying on historic comparables and were not expecting the market would now be differentiating on or prioritizing ESG and net zero carbon retrofit works in their investment strategy. So this is a very good example of the brown blight, or whatever you want to call it, brown discount, but it is something that is we'll get to see more and more. So from the investors' point of view, they do not want to be in a situation where they are looking at an asset and not able to convert that to net zero or take it on a journey. From the occupiers' side of things, I'll refer back to our survey again and the research work. About 60% of occupiers that we work with have already started setting their targets and goals. And this is true across all sectors and geographies, with large cap companies leading the way, essentially. So I think overall for occupiers, what they are aiming for is reducing their operational carbon emissions of the buildings with the added benefit of reducing costs for them, basically. So they're focusing a lot on performance of their assets and buildings, and then which affects the cost of operation. Another reason why occupiers are so interested in this zero carbon journey is the war of talent, as they call it these days, where there are the Gen Y and Gen Z wanting to work for companies that are making commitments to reach to net zero, and also the benefits of having a green, sustainable building and putting your best buildings for your best employees to get the right productivity. So I think there is a shift on both the investors and the occupiers side, but we are seeing it getting more and more prominent in the market.
Thanks, Nidhi. Nathan, if we can turn to you and start to explore the technology advances, how are digital engineering solutions such as digital twins being used to reduce the carbon footprint of buildings?
Thank you, Ken. So it's very wide-ranging questions. I'll try and focus in on a few specific areas of innovation. I think innovation, first and foremost, is a good place to start with answering this. What we're seeing in the built environment sector in general, and as we see increasingly a convergence of technology and software with the traditional disciplines of the built environment, i.e., architecture, engineering, construction, and operations, we are seeing a lot of innovation in the market globally, and sustainability, ESG goals, and reducing the carbon footprint of our built environment is right at the top of driving that. So, I mean, today, according to the research that I see, 40% of carbon emissions globally are due to the built environment sector, and that's that includes both new construction as well as the emissions from existing assets out there in the cities, in our cities. So, I mean, if we look, go forward from today, 2021, fast forward to 2050, at least 80% of the buildings in place today will still be there. So only 20% of the buildings in 30 years time or 29 years time will be new builds. So whilst there's been rightly a lot of focus on design technologies such as design and construction, digital twinning, building information modeling, to help us to understand the data that underpins our buildings, we also need to focus very much on on retrofitting. I think both Phil and Nidhi have mentioned retrofitting as so already. We need to be able to get into the existing building stocks of our cities and retrofit the buildings themselves, but that starts with the data that underpins them. So for us and as technologists in the built environment sector, everything there is, again, rightly, a lot of focus on innovative new technologies and new ways of capturing data. But what's a lot of times missing is a real focus and understanding on what to do with that data once you have it, and more importantly, how to structure that data. So I've spent a lot of my career working with standards bodies in the construction sector and in the property sector, doing really, if I could say, the boring work behind the scenes of providing, effectively being a librarian. When I was young, we had card catalogs in libraries still, and we had what was called the Dewey Decimal System, which hopefully most people still know what that is. How to categorize all the different books and types of books and genres of books that exist. We need critically the same thing for the building data that underpins our cities. Now, there's a lot of work that's gone on to establish that. Importantly, a lot of work has been replicated many times. So rather than having one or two or three overlapping, adjacent standards, we have a proliferation of many standards. The RICS has done a lot of very important work on this front and is leading the way in many regards with trying to bring the more and more organizations and more governments under a larger tent, as it were, to try and a shared standard, even if it's only 60% as good as another standard, is better when it's shared rather than being in a silo. So digital twins, in particular, as we focus on I don't know, laser scanning, or technology such as this, which can capture the geometries of our existing built assets. We need to really focus on that common data environment, that common shared library that underpins it, and that's what our mission is. I mean, we start to see a couple of examples. In Singapore, the Nanyang Technical University recently released a case study where they focused on the decarbonization outputs, or their ability to measure carbon output, because if you can't measure something, you can't track how well you're doing against reducing it, using digital twin technologies in Singapore, and they reckon they reduced 8.2 million tons of carbon annually. This was again a case study from Nanyang Technical University. In Dubai, our colleagues at Siemens, who are one of many organizations pushing the boundaries here, have created a digital twin as part of Expo 2020 for the entire 200-hectare gated Dubai Expo site, and that's a centerpiece within the World Built Environment Forum of the Expo, and is really being focused on as they say, aggregating, analyzing, and visualizing the data in order to enable smart decision making. So you have to have a model, and you have to be able to connect it to the real world. That's the kind of basic definition of a digital twin, as opposed to a 3D model or building information model, is that it connects to the actual physical asset. And that's a challenge that's being addressed by many centers of innovation, many different vendors. But how you then take that data, make sense of it, and share it broadly in a standard format with the team, I think is a key focus for us.
Thank you, Nathan. Nidhi, if we can turn to you. How is clean technology helping real estate to become carbon neutral?
That is, again, a very good question, and I think it ties up with what Nathan was talking about. But I mean, there are technologies such as sensors, energy storage, batteries, etc., that have been around for a while now. But now the focus is moving on how we make the existing technologies cleaner and greener. So there are a lot of products in the market, but cost is often seen as a limiting factor. So there's a bit of a pushback in the industry as we see it. What we hear from our clients is that they want something that can be done now and at a very low cost. So we are telling the organizations we work with that they need to focus on, and we can help them deliver return on sustainability that yields a greater financial, environmental, and social reward. So technology as it stands, or clean technology as it stands, is one of the top investment priorities for our occupiers. And from the survey that we carried out, about 38% of our investor clients are already using technology to optimize their performance and maintenance. And this is expected to be double in another 3 years' time by 2025. So it has a critical role in driving this transition to net zero. And also having that kind of technology in place, not just for systems, but also in terms of your carbon emissions monitoring, it just enables a greater transparency. Within JLL, we've got an arm, JLL Technologies, that has recently invested in turntide technology. So this is just an example I wanted to give you guys, where what we've done is we've partnered with turntide technologies. And what this company really does is it builds electric motors. And this innovation, what we're working with them, is basically going to reduce the energy requirement for electric motors that are used in our AC systems, are used in our lifts and fans and elevators that exist in our built environments. And very interesting is that a study that came out of this innovation is that if we were to replace all the motors of all the buildings that exist on our planet, we would save about 2.3 gigatons of carbon, which would equate to about replacing or adding in 7 Amazon rainforests on the planet. So overall, you know, technologies such as this, where we are trying to make what already exists much more cleaner and greener, is something that we are focusing a lot, and the industry is focusing a lot as well. There are lots of little innovations happening in different parts of the world. What we now need to do is join the dots and identify those partnerships, whether it's with academia, whether it's with manufacturers, with developers, contractors. We need to come together to widespread these technologies on the built environment. So that's where I think we need to focus when it comes to clean technology partnerships as we go forward.
Thank you, Nidhi. That's great. If we can turn back to you, Nathan, how is the design and construction of new buildings being shaped by Net Zero 2050?
Yeah, okay. In a lot of ways, I think well, first and foremost, there's a couple of different. So Net Zero 2050 is kind of is a major push alongside the I suppose reimagining of especially commercial off working spaces as a result of the changing ways that we interact after the pandemic. So both of these things and the proliferation of remote technologies, the advance of remote working and flexible working in many organizations around the world, I think is shaping the design of new buildings as much as and helping us to contribute, I believe, in terms of reduced reduced commutes, reduced use of transport in cities to Net Zero 2050. So that's one element. We also have an increasing, and I for me personally, very welcome, increase in the I suppose forestization, if you want to call it that, of our urban environments, but actually the intertwining of green, and literally green, plants and and green spaces into the fabric of our building, many of our new buildings around the world, which I think is a very positive move. It's just much more. It's just pleasant, isn't it, in the cities when you have green space. So another big focus in terms of and technology, in particular, and again back to what I was just talking about a few moments ago with regard to data, is this idea of the circular economy, which is which quite simply is rather than creating new instances, as it were, of products all the time for every new build and or for every break fix facilities management issue that happens in an existing building, we look to reduce, reuse, and repeat with regard to the products that we put into our buildings. Why spend the carbon to go and manufacture a new motor, as Nidhi was saying, when you can repair the existing one and or reuse it elsewhere. So in order to make that happen, and we had here in the UK and London in a few years back, as many of us, I'm sure all of us will be aware, we had the Grenfell tragedy, where it became clear that we effectively did not know to any reliable degree what was in our building, in that building in particular, but more broadly in any of our existing assets. And in order to know that, we need to be able to first and foremost identify what products are installed into our building fabrics, where they came from, who supplied them, what how they were produced, what their energy ratings are, et cetera, et cetera. So as we look to improve that, going forward, new codes have been introduced in the wake of that in the UK by government, as to the responsibilities of builders and developers to track, and keep tabs on the products that are being installed. That's really put some urgency into this idea of product identification and again, the underlying data. So if you have a new building that you're going to put up, and you get a design team together, and they work in a building information modeling shared environment, and the architects, the engineers, all the consultants, all of these subcontractors are providing and inputting data, and or work products into that building. If we're able to track and consistently label and detail all of those in a way that at the end of that process, we're able to hand over a digital twin, but most importantly, a digital twin that really has the object level detail of what's gone into that building and can track it back to the supply chain, then we are able to enable that circular economy, right? Because you can't reuse what you don't know what it is, again, and that's a core fundamental problem. Now, if we're retrofitting, that's much more difficult when we're retrofitting, I should say, as again, 80% of assets by 2050 are going to be existing. We have in each instance of every building, depending on the supply chain that's put it together and when it was done, you have a different set of challenges. But at the very least, there are many technologies that have come out that can feed the data about what the materials are, even if you don't know necessarily where it came from in the supply chain. You can at least determine the density, the materials that it's made of, the fundamental way it works, and label that back into a shared model. So I think the kind of confluence of building information modeling, digital twinning, and also, as I said, these larger societal forces with regard to the uses that we're seeing in our particularly in our commercial office spaces, and residential, off the back of the changes we've seen in the last couple of years, are are kind of coming together to really change the fabric of our cities. You know, and you know, again, as I hope to see more and more of intertwining, you know, not just green technology and green building assets, but also, you know, the living planet itself into our cities. I studied urban planning in my career. I have a soft spot for green cities. Thank you, Ken.
Great, thanks, Nathan. Nidhi, let's turn back to you and talk about measurement. This concept has been mentioned a few times. How is the carbon footprint of buildings being measured and reported?
Yeah, I mean, as you can see, most organizations and companies have made now commitments to either science-based targets or race to zero. They've signed climate pledges. They're following World Green Building Council's carbon targets. They've got to report on TCFD and various different commitments and requirements. Now, I think with all of these, what organizations are finding is difficult to identify different KPIs and metrics. So each of these commitments would ask you to report on certain things, and that would be represented either through your annual report, or you report something separately on those organizations' websites. I think overall there is, I would say in the industry, a lack of a standard that applies to all companies and helps them identify how to measure this carbon footprint of buildings. I mean, there are, don't get me wrong, there are lots of different guidelines and frameworks that exist. We've got the ISO 15978 that looks at life cycle assessment and how do you capture carbon for different stages of building and built environment. There is various different standards, and I know that RICS is now coming up with ICMS 3, which will be launched in November, which would set up a requirement or a framework, a consistent approach to carbon reporting. So I think that would be something really good to have for the industry, to have a requirement or a guideline on how to report and measure carbon. So there is a little bit of an understanding of what carbon is, of course, with companies understanding their company level carbon emissions in terms of scopes, so scopes 1, 2, and 3. And when it comes to the asset at the building level, we are talking about the operational carbon, the embodied carbon. Now, the challenge that we've seen with our clients is that there is no one silver bullet that solves the problem of measuring reporting. So I think every company has to try and find the what suits best for their business and makes sense. So in terms of tools and platforms, I'm aware there are lots of tools and platforms in the market. We've come up with our own platform that helps our organizations we work with to benchmark their emissions against various different targets that they've set, and also helps them to report on various different commitments, including neighbors or energy staff, wherever they are based in the world. So I think in terms of looking at data or in terms of looking at measuring and reporting, we need to have some sort of standard guidelines. And I'm hoping that the new methodology that would come out from RICS would be really helpful for that. In terms of measuring the carbon emissions, there are certain challenges when it comes to different asset classes or building types. So we can say that if you are looking after an asset which is under your direct control, you've got access, or you can influence change, you can measure the carbon emissions from that building in terms of energy use in a relatively easier way. But if you haven't got control on the asset, where you've got a lease, tenants are paying their own energy bills, and they are looking after their energy reduction as well, then in that case, it is difficult to get that data. So as an investor, if you've got lots of assets where if you've not included in the lease for the tenants to share their carbon emissions data with you, it becomes a bit of a challenge to report on your own emissions, which would definitely affect. So overall, I think there's that understanding now going forward between tenants and landlords, where tenants are also asking, what sort of energy performance they should have to be able to use that particular building, and landlords are trying to put those requirements into clauses so that when it comes to making sure that the asset follows the net zero carbon pathway, we are on the right track. So there are a few hurdles to resolve when it comes to measuring, reporting carbon emissions. But at the same time, I think there are lots of opportunities with these green lease clauses that we can negotiate with tenants and landlords, with taking the tenants on a journey to make them understand what the building should perform and how can they contribute. So there is, I think, a long way to go, but the conversations have already started on this particular aspect. And I think that there would be a big change coming in soon in terms of how rents are organized, how leases and the contracts are signed as well. So I think there's much more work to be done in terms of measuring our actual carbon emissions and then reporting on it.
Thank you, Nidhi. That's great. Phil, if we can turn to you, the next question is, what difficulties do owners and occupiers face to make buildings carbon neutral? How can good policy help overcome these challenges? Would also welcome you to comment on some of the great points that have been made.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I mean, it's a key question. So as I mentioned back at the start, a lot of the sort of low-hanging fruit in terms of decarbonisation has been taken advantage of already in the UK. So as we move to decarbonising buildings and transport, etc., recognising these difficulties and designing the policy to help people overcome them, I think is the key next step. I think to step back, net zero is such a huge transition that we're experiencing here. So it's effectively the biggest shift in the global economy since the Industrial Revolution. So you really need governments to start developing very impactful policy in order to incentivize the changes that are needed to achieve this goal. So the scale in the UK, obviously we're a relatively small country in the global context, but if you even just look at the residential market in the UK, the scale of decarbonisation that needs to occur is something around 1 million homes per year between now and 2050 need to be decarbonised. So when you think of that, it really sort of gives you an idea of the challenge that we're faced with. So I think there's probably two key barriers to helping people decarbonise their buildings. So I think the first is you have to make them want to do it, and secondly, it has to make economic sense. So to the first point, people aren't going to even think of decarbonising their buildings if they're not aware of the impact that the building is having in terms of emissions. So I think there was some research I saw recently which it was a poll that asked homeowners what actions they would take at home to reduce emissions as much as possible. So the action that came out on top was recycling, which is kind of concerning, and changing your heating system from a gas boiler, for example, to a low carbon heating option came down in 5th or 6th. I think we've got an issue there that only roughly half of the population are aware that their gas boiler, for example, is contributing to carbon emissions. So if people aren't aware of the impacts that their building is having, then they're not going to even consider making the changes that are required. So one of the things that we're doing at the moment is a lot of research into attitudes and behaviour changes that are required for net zero. And something that's coming out of that is the need for government to instigate a very comprehensive communications plan to inform the public of where emissions are coming from and what changes are needed. So that's just the first step in creating awareness. And then once you've created awareness and people are interested in making changes, then you have to make economic sense, and that's where the policy comes in. So first you need the clear communications, and then you need the policy. So in terms of the policy, there's lots of different options out there, and I hope to come with some clarity on what the UK government is planning at the moment, but there's a sort of a key heat and building strategy that we've been waiting for 6 months, and it sounds like it's going to be published next week. It couldn't be just before the webinar today, unfortunately. But some of the things you might expect to see in there are sort of government-backed interest-free or low-interest loans to help people and small businesses install low-carbon heating systems or pay for energy efficiency upgrades. One of the key policies that we might see in there, and there's quite a good example of the conflicting policies that we have at the moment, is if you're a domestic customer in the UK, you're paying roughly £257 of policy costs on your electricity bill and only about £4 on your gas bill. So that the incentive there is completely wrong. If we're trying to get people to switch away from highly emitting gas boilers to low emitting electricity heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps, then you need to make electricity bills cheaper and create that incentive to switch. So at the moment, people are paying far more, 250-ish pounds more on their electricity bill just for the policy costs. So one of the changes that is rumoured is that might be switched over to gas bills to try and incentivise, and that's just an example of some of the mismatches that we've got in the current system that need to be corrected. Some of the other policy levers that can be used, so there's rumours of a phase-out date for gas boilers being introduced. So this is similar to something we've seen in the transport sector in the UK, where there is now a 2030 phase-out date for petrol and diesel vehicles. That's sent a really clear signal to the market, and now you're seeing vehicle manufacturers pour investment into electric vehicles, low carbon vehicles, and start to divest away from fossil fuels. So I think those are great examples of what policy can do. Just an interesting example that we've seen in Canada as well. So the government there is using, is distributing a lot of the revenues that they're receiving from carbon taxes back to the public through rebates. So this is one way of raising awareness that carbon is being taxed, and it's also creating a benefit for those people that are installing low carbon measures, and they're able to receive payments through these rebates. I think there's some difficulty in terms of the existing building stock. If you look at the UK again as an example, we've got some of the oldest and leakiest buildings in Europe and probably in the world. So there's a big challenge to overcome there in terms of improving the energy efficiency of those buildings. But I don't think it really stands as a barrier to reaching net zero. I think the challenge might be slightly harder, but there are numerous energy efficiency upgrade options that are out there and have been for a while, and really it's just the policy that is missing from government to unlock the investment into this sector. One of the key areas is investing in the supply chain so that people that want to install energy efficiency upgrades are able to. We saw recently there was a £9 billion fund announced last autumn as part of the Green Recovery Fund from COVID, and only £1 billion of that was uptaken by consumers because a lot of people that wanted to access these energy efficiency upgrades weren't able to because the demand was beyond what the supply chain was able to provide. So it has to be thought through from all the way through from the supply chain to the end customer, I think, and investment has to go all the way through there. And then I think really, so if we're talking about decarbonising buildings, there's two aspects to it. So you need to improve the efficiency to reduce the amount that we're using, and this is critical as we shift from gas to electricity, because as more and more buildings move to an electric heating system, we're putting more pressure on the electricity grid, and that requires more investment in power generation. So we need to limit the sort of needless losses as much as possible. And then we need to shift and change focus from any sort of fossil fuel heating system over to a low carbon system. So ultimately, I think there's no issue really in the technology needed to decarbonise buildings. It's mainly just the policy required to sort of reorientate that investment towards less low carbon solutions.
Thanks, Phil. Before we go to Huda, I'd like to bring you in for our last formal question. I'd like to remind the audience to please send in your questions. We have a few that we'll turn to after Huda answers this question. And then if we do have time, I'll maybe ask the panelists for a final thought before we come up to the end of the hour. But let's get to our last formal question, Huda. How does the carbon neutrality agenda fit with the more recent focus on well-being and resilience?
Thank you very much, Ken. So this is an interesting question, and depending on your point of view, could be controversial or contentious. So, I mean, similar to Nathan, I have a background in urban planning as well as in environmental science. And the way I look at cities is from a people perspective and a planet perspective. And if we look at SDG 11, the goal around cities, United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 11 around cities, it talks about making cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So carbon neutrality helps with safety, helps with resilience, helps with sustainability. But if we see carbon neutrality as the ultimate goal, singular goal in and of itself, we may actually find ourselves in a world that we don't want to live in. It might be a climate neutral world, but it may be one that's not, that's not the kind of environmentally flourishing place we want to live in, or socially cohesive place we want to live in, or inclusive, equitable place we want to live in. And I'm not saying the targets or the objectives are mutually exclusive, not at all. I think it just takes a bit of strategic, holistic planning so that the outcome we do get to in 2030 or 2050 or beyond actually is not only climate neutral, but also we're talking about the four things: inclusive, safe, resilient, sustainable. So to give you some examples, and this is kind of a lot of times what my day-to-day job is, advising cities, advising developers, private and public sector clients. If we look at transport, for example, and COVID was a really interesting test. So if we were planning a city for the only one objective, which is to achieve climate neutrality in the fastest, quickest way we could, we may opt for kind of electric vehicles all the way, powered by zero carbon energy. So that will get us to carbon neutrality. What it doesn't give us, though, it doesn't give us the multimodal transport network, so the options, the flexibility we need to have a resilient city, just in case our renewable energy source shuts off for whatever reason. It also doesn't give us the active transport we need so walking and cycling, whether it's the last mile or the whole journey, with the active transport that we need as part of our daily life from a physical and a mental health well-being perspective, and as well as a community perspective. So just by when making decisions around long-term big move strategies, climate neutrality is a critical, essential, absolutely, it's urgent, it's a priority, and it needs to be seen as one of many priorities. So that because what we don't have is we don't have the opportunity to get to climate neutrality in 20-30 years and then start thinking about resilience, inclusivity. It's going to be too late at that time. We definitely have a challenge ahead of us in terms of whether it's retrofitting our cities or how do we develop better cities moving forward. And the way we think about better needs to be climate neutral and resilient and safe and inclusive. So that's, I hope that answers the question. I'm happy to discuss further in the question and answer.
Fantastic. Thanks, Huda. And let's turn to some of these audience questions and see how many we can address. Maybe I'll start with the most straightforward. Nidhi, your comment about the Amazon rainforest sparked some interest, and Jeremy asks you to please repeat that stat. So what is it that you said?
So if all motors in the world were to be replaced with turn-tide motors, then we intend to save about 2.3 gigatons of carbon emissions for the globe, that is, which equates to about 6 to 7 Amazon forests, if we were to look at it from that perspective. So yeah, there's a lot of carbon saving involved, but that's only if we were to replace every motor that exists in every building in the world, and that's how much of carbon that we will save.
Great, thanks. Chris asks a question. The UN Race to Zero is the gold standard for organizations reducing their carbon emissions. What is the RICS doing to encourage its members to follow the lead of likes of CBRE, JLL, Avison Young, Bidwell's, Cushman & Wakefield, and others to sign up to UN Race to Zero? Thanks, Chris. I'll go ahead and answer that question. The RICS strongly supports Race to Zero and other like initiatives, and I'll give a specific example that also I think answers your question. So we're part of the World Economic Forum's effort for the built-in natural environment, and this effort is complementary and part of the UN Race to Zero. And the specific angle that RICS is taking is about measurement. And I think this is vitally important, and it was alluded to by a few of our panelists, specifically Needy, where we can't achieve, or we won't know what progress we're making unless we can measure that progress. And one of the problems that we have is, well, one is frankly greenwashing or something similar, where organizations can make announcements like Race to Zero or net neutral by a date, and there's really no agreed, neutral, independent way to measure and compare that. But what we do have is we have this profession, quantity surveyors and others, who are specifically experts in doing just that. And as Needy mentioned, ICMS 3 is coming out just in time for COP26, which is an international standard. It's a coalition that I lead, which created a standard for cost and also of building and life cycle for buildings, and now for reporting carbon. And so for the first time, there's going to be a globally consistent way of reporting carbon so that we can get this consistency, this comparability, and of course, vitally important that it's measured by professionals. So I think there's a very important point here where similar, I think analogous to the role of a professional accountant in reporting financial information, we need to have independent, quality assured, regulated professionals reporting, for example, carbon in these assets to achieve these goals. It's vitally important. Great, thanks for that, Chris. So another question we have, which is, and maybe I'll turn to you, Nathan. Maybe you can help me with this. This is an interesting one, and it refers back to the Doomsday book that was put together before the year 2000 issue. And just comment, and Stephen asked this question, and he comments how that a lot of the information put together as it relates to property at that time has not really been used, but could be very useful in the efforts we're discussing today. I wonder if you have any comments about that kind of data or how that might be used in the current challenge. You're on mute.
Apologies. So I'm not 100% sure about what the Doomsday. Is he talking about the year 2000 bug in the IT systems?
Yeah, there was a book of, he says, electrical equipment connected to the built environment and how it connected to that Y2K problem, and if that could be something utilized today with carbon.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think, well, I was around and kicking in IT systems in the lead up to Y2K. I mean, well, first of all, there's a whole topic we don't really have time to get into here in depth about the risks and security risks that, and this also ties into Phil was earlier talking about policy and the push to net zero, and we have a whole energy security element that we need to also consider on a global geopolitical level, which is kind of needs to be managed as well as pushing towards net zero. But there is, yes, as we talk about digital twins and connect smart cities and connected infrastructure, and the benefits of that and enabling us to do things like measure carbon output. And by the way, we are tech partners with RICS, and just to the last question, enthusiastically implementing ICMS, IPMS, and the forthcoming IBOS with particularly some large customers in the Middle East. But nonetheless, there is a security element to that, to that opening up, right? As there always is. It needs to be carefully managed. I think government, as well as technology sector, with private sector as well as public, does very much have that in mind. It's front and center in many of the things that we do. This security element. Another angle to that, I suppose, is if you think about the Y2K thing, which was really widely seen in retrospect as shouting wolf, right? Crying wolf. But nonetheless, it did spur a lot of much needed solving of what we call technical debt, I think, in my space, or bringing systems up to kind of the modern times, and the push to net zero, along with, as Huda was rightly saying, resilience in our cities, well-being, the safety and basically physical infrastructure that we're building. All these things are major trends that are pushing us forward. Whether or not we specifically hit this target by this year or not, it's kind of like the push to adopt building information modeling across all UK government projects by 2012. It wasn't really about did 100% of everybody do it. It was more about this is a spur that's pushing us all forward in the right direction. I hope that's touched at least a bit on the question.
Okay. Well, we want to end a couple of minutes before the hour, so we only have a few minutes, but maybe if we can quickly, we have a great question from Gisela, who really asks about penalties for not following these plans and what we thought about that. Does anybody like to speak to penalties? No, nobody wants to speak about penalties. Okay.
I just talked, so I won't do it.
Okay. Well, let's move to another question.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah. When I'm talking about penalties, I think we are seeing I wouldn't say trend, but there are things now being imposed in terms of penalties when you're not reaching certain carbon targets, especially in the built environment sector. For example, in London, we've got, for any new developments, different boroughs have now introduced carbon tax that you have to pay up front for the first 30 years of the building emissions in operation. So there are certain areas where you see that penalties in the form of tax are currently being introduced. There's one great example in New York that has come out where 1 ton of carbon is going to cost about $268, and that would be applicable from 2030 onwards, if I'm not wrong, for any building that they've understood or realized certain energy intensity or use intensity for different building types. And if your building is emitting more than that or has more energy use as compared to the benchmarks, then you've got to pay some tax on it. Or in terms of whether you call it penalty, whether you call it fine or tax, I think they are on the same lines. So yeah, we are seeing a lot of these regulations coming into place, and yes, it's not the best approach, but in a way, it's really driving investors and occupiers and thinking about what they can do today to not have that sort of or pay that sort of penalty later down the line. So yeah, I think it's important to have that, and there are a few examples in the industry.
Thanks, Nidhi.
Really quickly, sorry.
Sorry, we just have a short time left. Go ahead.
Yeah, just very quickly on that. I think as part of the penalty scheme, you need to have something that we mentioned earlier, very clear measuring and verification. So people are going to be subject to penalties, and they want to be sure that it's a robust system. And I think that's really important. And as Nidhi was saying, I think she mentioned earlier, the idea of stranded assets, and as the regulation is going to inevitably come in, there needs to be clarity in terms of the direction of that regulation and how it's being sort of measured and verified.
Great, thanks, Phil, and thank you all. As we come up to the top of the hour, thank you all for your questions. We didn't get to them all, but there will be follow-up. We will be answering these questions through the WebF site. Thank you to the panel, specifically Nathan, the CEO of Asite, who is the forum's lead tech partner, We will be publishing a recording and a written summary, so feel free to share that and see the answers to the other questions. Join us for another webinar in the future. You have recently seen that the COP26 webinar mini-series is on our website for further details. And also you can watch any previous webinars that you may have missed. The World Built Environment Forum Global Summit will be visiting Dubai as part of Expo 2020 Dubai in January of 2022. The program will focus on the livable city, agile, healthy, and resilient. You can book your ticket today. Please visit the website rics.org/WBEF for further details. Also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, where you can receive news of upcoming webinars as well as recently published articles. Finally, please download the WebF app from the App Store or Google Play, where you can access the latest innovative global thought leadership content across the built environment. Until next time, goodbye, and thank you again for your great questions and our excellent panel. Goodbye.